Hi, Caz. I'd like to thank you for joining me today to talk about housing. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that make up the Cowper electorate, the Kumbanya, Dunghutti and Biripi people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. So let's get started straight into it with the cost of housing. It's no secret that house prices and rents have been skyrocketing across the electorate and much of regional Australia.
Yes.
Really interested to hear your views on the local housing situation and the impact or the potential impact that a lack of affordable housing is having on the community and our workforce.
Thanks, Emma. Look, my view is that housing is actually one of the most pressing issues of our generation, not just in Cowper, but everywhere in Australia at the moment. To be blunt, the housing situation in Cowper is absolutely horrific. And as of Wednesday, the latest inflation figures, we know it's only going to get worse. So according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, our underlying inflation now stands at the highest level since March 2009. So year on year, that's us risen by 5.1%. And that is beyond frightening for the housing situation. So during the last 3 months, I've done a lot of talking and listening to people about issues that matter most to them. And with regards to housing, I've taken on board heartbreaking stories, many people who have lost all dignity and hope because they can't find safe and secure place for themselves and their families to sleep at night, let alone a place to call home. So I've spoken with people who are living in cars, in tents, in backyards, paddocks, pitching tents, trying to just have a roof over their head. The impact of the housing crisis is so multifaceted. For a long time, there have been politicians who pointed to social housing as the root of intergenerational poverty. I don't believe that to be the case. The message has been, if you want to improve your situation, get a job and get a mortgage. And that's really patently unfair and untrue. And I've spoken to people from many parts of our community, from people living with socioeconomic disadvantage through to small business people. The common thread is they can no longer afford to rent or buy a home in this community. So I know of a business in Coffs where 3 skilled workers all have full-time jobs. They're all actually earning above the award wage for their area of work that they're working in, and they cannot find a home to rent. So all 3 of these people are in their 20s, one of them with a small young family. And they're all living in their parents' homes. Luckily, they've got that option because they cannot afford to find a home of their own. But, we've had so many stories. I've met stories of business people. I met someone in Southwest Rocks who has a really thriving little business who's been saving for 5 years while renting. She's a single mum, 3 kids, done extremely well with her business and got some good savings behind her. Now her house has been sold out from under her. It's going to become an Airbnb. And she's contemplated selling her business so she can boost her savings so that she can get a loan to buy a home for her family, but then she's going to be unemployed. So she's now being forced to sell her business and leave the community because she can't find anywhere else to live. So these are just a couple of heart-wrenching stories of housing insecurity. It illustrates the lack of affordable housing in our community, and the impact is far-reaching. We're experiencing a labour shortage. Ask anyone who manages retail, hospitality, tourism, caring, agriculture, trade, labouring business. Workers are very hard to find. And why? There's nowhere affordable for them to live.
We certainly could keep talking about that, and it leads into our next question around the role of government in housing. What do you see as the role of government, and you specifically if elected, in the housing space? Are there local priorities or broader federal initiatives that you'd champion? And, where's the difference between aspiration and achievable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the reasons I'm running for the federal election is I believe that we need to cascade some legislation from the federal down, and it needs to ripple through all levels of government, and there needs to be a unified approach. So right now in Australia, there is no national housing policy. There are, however, throngs of lobbyists influencing government policies where their only interest is to fuel the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And we know that there are people within the housing industry, lobbyists, that are actually donating to the major political parties at the moment in this election. So lucky for us, we've got some pretty fine charities in our region, advocacy groups, and peak bodies who are at the coalface of the issue. So I need to tap into the knowledge and experience locally, which I've already been doing over the last 8 weeks. And I need to really help define the role of government in this housing space, because quite frankly, no one's actually given it the attention that it deserves or needs at a federal level yet. So National Shelter, which is a non-government peak organisation, aims to improve housing access, affordability, appropriateness, safety, security for people in low incomes, has released a really great suite of policy recommendations for the federal election. Not surprisingly, one of their top priorities is for the incoming government to establish a national housing strategy. So they've called for the incoming government to build at least 25,000 new social housing units nationwide. I'd say that's a minimum. Our government hasn't invested, in fact, we've divested in social housing over the decades if you look at the trends compared to population. The National Shelter has detailed a list of policy priorities to tackle the housing crisis in Australia, including organisations that are able to provide secure and stable accommodation and get government funding to do that. Don't forget, all the government funding, all the money that we spend in government is a government choice. It's not because there's no money left for people who are suffering in housing. It's the government's choice to put $11.6 billion worth of subsidies into the fossil fuel industry annually. And it's the government's choice to keep wages suppressed and keep people struggling the way they are. Home ownership is declining in Australia for people under 40, with too many young people sleeping rough, more and more older women facing housing uncertainty. I've got many stories, as I've already shared with you, in Cowper about people in housing insecurity. It's unsurprising that one of the questions I get asked most frequently is, how are you going to address the housing crisis? So we can't avoid, I don't believe we can avoid this very difficult and complex question any longer in this country. We as a community, as an electorate, as a nation, need well-informed strategic long-term housing policy that meets the existing challenges. And that's going to be asking some tough questions. And those questions might be, is it time for tax breaks, for negative gearing housing investment to be scaled back? Is there a number of properties that someone can own before we cap that? Should limits be placed on how many homes an individual can own? As I just said, do we cap that? What percentages of homes in any area should be used as a tourist accommodation and assets? We've seen it in our area. We have people, local people, sleeping without homes, and we've got plenty of empty facilities empty for Airbnb and holiday purposes. Do we CPI index the rental rises so that we have some control over that? Do we cap that at a government level? Does the government invest more in rental properties, not just low socio-economic housing, but rental properties like other governments, Germany, other Scandinavian countries, where you get a government rental and it's a secure government rental with a cap on the inflation to that rent over a lifetime?
Yeah, we've got there's certainly a lot there that you list that that government can do. We probably need to keep moving and talk about housing and climate change, potentially another big conversation, but we'll try and keep it as concise as we can. You know, we're no strangers to intense weather events in Cowper. We've had droughts, bushfires, floods, storms. We didn't experience the level of devastation in Lismore, thankfully, with their two successive floods. But there are some big questions that are being raised, and the role of government in dealing with these issues is definitely one of them. So how do we deal with housing and climate change? And how do we ensure that it isn't the groups that are already vulnerable facing the biggest impacts and risks?
Okay, thanks, Emma. Look, I'll try and keep this succinct. Climate change is one of the main platforms is a reason that I'm running in this election. Climate change is not just another government policy, it's an existential global crisis. We know that because there are scientists in Australia and there are scientists around the world telling us that these weather events, like the one you've just highlighted in Lismore and the fires that we experienced in Cowper ourselves only a couple of years ago, are only going to get worse. Our current government does not recognise that we have a climate emergency. This week, we've heard members of the National Party saying that our coal emission targets and reduction targets are dead in the water and they're things that we can play around with and move around into the future. We need a real commitment to climate change. We need to understand and plan for the fact that people are living at risk in areas that are going to continue to be impacted by fires and flooding and coastal erosion in our region. We already know that the hottest areas of Australia are those with the highest proportion of low-income residents. The flip side of the extreme weather we're experiencing is all these storm events, and therefore on the surface the problem's twofold. Homes use resources and therefore create emissions and contribute to our climate change. Building new homes, if we need new housing stock, needs timber from our forests, therefore contributing to climate change as well. So we need across the board proper approach, first and foremost, to climate change, to industry standards, to new and innovative ways of thinking about housing. And we need to make sure that we consider that it's not the low socioeconomic people living in low-lying and flood areas. I know of people in Port Macquarie living in caravans in a caravan park permanently where they've been washed out 2 or 3 times now, and there's nowhere else for them to go. So we've got a lot to do, and we need to make sure that it's not people's hip pockets, because we've got to fix up houses, because we've got to install renewable concepts and sustainable concepts such as batteries and solar and energy efficiency into housing to combat climate change. We've got to make sure that cost doesn't flow on to the renters, that cost goes on to the homeowners, and that we have government subsidies going into new industries to address climate change, not going into the fossil fuel industries where it currently is. As I said, 11.6 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry could be going towards us dealing with these very real crises. And as we know, having a roof over your head is a basic human right.
All right, well, we'll keep moving on to housing solutions. As you may know from our work, the Housing Matters Action Group is very focused on unlocking innovative local solutions while also advocating for broader system change. Is there anything that you see as a key project or concept or policy that you would make a difference in the housing space that you'd like to mention just as we finish up?
I think it's really great, thanks Emma, I think it's really great that we are looking to local solutions. We're looking to house share type situations, housing cooperative type situations. In Bellingham, we've repurposed an old nursing home into housing for low socioeconomic people. But I think ultimately what we need to do is not keep pushing these crises back onto community that's already giving the maximum and suffering the same ills as everybody else, between those that have and have not. We need to carefully examine our tax and social security systems and the role it plays in limiting opportunities for affordable housing. There's significant, disincentives for people to downsize at the moment, for people to move out of, if they're getting a pension, move out of their family home because they're going to get hit in their hip pocket. We need to look at legislation at a higher level that will cascade to support organisations like yours that are working really hard to try and fix it on the ground, but it's not going to happen while we don't have the proper government support. So we need to look at rental accommodation in regards to security. We need to look at further government investment, rigorous government investment in social and rental properties. We need caps, we need all types of solutions. That means we have to have the hard questions about financial reform at the highest level of government.
Nice. Well, thanks, Caz.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for your time and willingness to talk housing. We could talk much longer about any of those topics that we've discussed. I know that it's a very busy 6 weeks, so all the best with the campaign.
Thanks so much, Emma. Thank you.